So, so I want to start just by kind of talking about the frame for my book on the Panthers, and then I'll launch into kind of a broader social and political history of the party itself. So this is my book, Living for the City, and I want to show you the cover because I chose this cover for a reason. You know, the Panthers are often thought of in particular ways, and they're one of the social movement organizations from the 1960s that has had a continuity and remains important to contemporary political consciousness, which apart from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or maybe even SCLC, is actually kind of rare. A lot of those 1960s organizations have not remained part of historical memory. But one of the issues in writing a book about the party and having written a PhD dissertation in the late 90s and early 2000s is that a particular vision of the party dominates historical memory, which is men with guns, with black leather jackets and berets and a kind of paramilitary image of the party. So when I published my book 10 years ago, I insisted that they put this image on the cover, and it's an image from Stephen Seamus, who was one of the Panther photographers. And what you'll notice about this image is that it doesn't center a single group of men. None of the leaders are on the cover. That is not Huey Newton or Bobby Seale, the founders of the party. It's a rank and file party member who taught in the school. And it's actually a picture of the Panthers house band called the Lumpen, which was a kind of Sly and the Stone family. So a Sly and the Family Stone soul band. And if you notice, there are lots of children and women in the background, and it's actually a protest of Black businesses in order to get them to support the free breakfast programs. So I really wanted a community-based image of the party. So what I'll be talking about today is just talking about the genesis and the catalyst of the party in the early 60s, and then give you a sense of its trajectory over time. So I like to start often with these images. I call it before and after the Black Power, Black Panther Party. And so I'm going to show you images from 1955, and then we're going to fast forward until 1968. So these are taken in the same park in that 13-year span. So this is DeFremery Park in Oakland in 1955. This is a state-sponsored recreation program that was used to target migrant children, so the children of people that migrated from the South, and to kind of teach them comportment and manners. And this is the same park. This is literally the same location in 1968. Same thing here, fraternal organization for young men. And then 13 years later, same physical site, geographic site, 1968. And so one of the tasks is to try to understand how this amazing revolution of young people happened, their revolution in self-conception, and also their creation of a new type of politics and a new organization. One of the big things that underlies the founding of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California in 1966 is the shifting migration patterns. And I think that this is very different, for example, than comparing it to the protests today for many reasons. But it's during and after World War II. You have the single largest Black population movement in history. The Great Migration of World War I is much better known. But in total numbers, really the creation of these large urban Black communities, and the idea of inner city or urban being Black is a post-war creation, so post-World War II. And you can see the Black areas represent Black population settlement that's 80 to 95%. So you can see the shift from 1940 on the top left, where the Black population is roughly 2%. In 1950, it's 10%. By 1960, it's reaching 20%. And then by 1980, it's a majority. As you can see, though, this population is really affected by residential segregation. So by the time you get to 1980, that's a majority Black population, but concentrated in East and West Oakland. And a lot of the story that I'll be talking about is taking place at the very bottom in West Oakland. So one of the surprises, as I said, the image of the Black Panther Party with police patrols, which I'll be talking about in a moment, it's known for those iconic moments with berets and guns and the March on Sacramento. But the truth is, the party's history extends into the early 60s. And it's actually founded at a community college called Merritt College, which still exists today. In the early 1960s, it's called Oakland City College, and it changes its name by 1965. So one of my major points about thinking about the genesis of the party is that people learn about the party largely through the March on Sacramento when there was a shift in gun laws. But the actual infrastructure came from a study group. So one of my core arguments in the book is that it's a little known history of the Black Panther Party that it actually started with a study group. And that study group was called the Afro-American Association. So Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who are the two founders of the party, they meet in the early 60s when they are both community college students. Something that's important about this is that at this time in California, all three levels, the University of California system, so Berkeley, UCLA, Santa Cruz, Riverside, all of the three different tiers of public higher education were free in California. And that's really important. Anyone in California that had either a high school equivalency or a high school diploma had the right to attend higher education. So when we've talked about higher education 50 years later and the Bernie campaign and before, it's treated off free higher education. It's treated as if it's this impossible pipe dream, but it actually did exist in California in the post-war period. And it is this access of populations to the university that is key to seeing the mobilization, the formation of the Black Panther Party, the formation of the ethnic studies programs, the San Francisco State Strike, and even the free speech movement are really led by a generation of young people who are the first to have access to public higher education. And it's a really important political history. It's not just a history, it's not only a fiscal history of educational access. This unprecedented access to the university at all levels, you know, a full level multiversity like University of California that grants PhDs, or community college that only grants associate degrees. So when I talk about the university, I mean it very broadly. So university, college, and community college. But it's this access to the university that really powers a new type of radicalism. So here I have the Black Panther Party 10-point program. It's a list of wants and beliefs. One of the striking things about it is that it starts with the platform number one. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. So it starts in some ways with a demand that is linked to the Black Power movement, so Black self-determination. So Malcolm X is really he's not the only, but he's an essential inspiration for the party. But Malcolm X is assassinated in February 1965, and the party is not formed until October 1966. So more than a year and 2 months after the Watts Rebellion, the party is formed. But one of the important things about the origins of the party is that both Huey Newton and Bobby Seale are deeply influenced by Malcolm X. And part of the party is trying to imagine what would Malcolm X have done had he lived. So in the early years of the party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the two founders, talk about it as they see themselves as the heirs to Malcolm X. That's a quote. But the interesting thing about this 10-point program is, so it starts with classic self-determination, but then it goes through a series of wants and beliefs. 2, we want full employment for our people. 3, we want an end to the robbery of the robbery by the white men of our Black community. 4, we want decent housing fit for shelter for human beings. 5, we want education for our people that expresses the true nature of decadent American society. We want education that teaches us the true history and our role in present day society. 6, we want all Black men to be exempt from military service. 7, we want an end to police brutality and murder of Black people. 8, we want freedom for Black men held in federal, state, and county prisons and jails. 9, we want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in a court by their peer group of people from their Black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations sponsored plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony, in which only Black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purposes of determining the will of Black people as to their national destiny. So there's a lot to say about the 10-point program. We can talk about it more in question and answer, but it starts and ends with Malcolm X, which is important. It's Malcolm X who follows the famous communist William Patterson, who approaches the United Nations in 1951 with a platform of saying we charge genocide as a discourse for how to talk about African Americans' role in the United States. So Malcolm X follows William Patterson and makes this appeal and an argument that this is not just a fight for civil rights, but a fight for human rights that needs to be adjudicated outside the US. So those two pieces are important because a large part of the Panthers frame is an anti-colonial frame that extends beyond the boundaries of the United States versus a domestic appeal during the Cold War for the expansion of civil and political rights. The others you'll notice are clearly socialist demands. We want full employment, right to housing. So one of the things that the party is doing, it's a group that is created largely by people in their late teens and early 20s, many of them on a working class community college. So they're blending different kinds of political influences. You see the political influence of Malcolm X and Black nationalism, but you also see the influence by socialism, and then we'll see as the party begins to develop Marxism and Maoism. So they also invoke the language of the Declaration of Independence. So I think that that piece is very interesting. The party is started by young people in 1966, a year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but they're also influenced by the anti-colonial movements in Africa, in Cuba, and in Asia. So you can see in their ideology that they are a blend of different kinds of influences. So the party has actually a long history compared to many 1960s movement organizations. So it's founded in October 66, and we often talk about the first 2 years of the party's founding as armed struggle. So it starts with police patrols, which I'll be talking about in a minute. You also have a rhetoric in the newspaper of the embrace of armed self-defense. And the party's history is very much linked to the urban rebellions. So you've probably seen in corporate media, people comparing the protests that we see today with the protests in the 1960s, many of them comparing it with 1968. Although the truth is the urban rebellions in the US really start in 1963, 1964. There's an early one in Birmingham, and then in Harlem, the so-called Harlem Riot in 64. But the big kind of grandmother of them all is the Watts Rebellion, which at that time is the largest largest civil disturbance in American history that is superseded only by the LA Rebellion in 1992. So this first period, 66 to 68, is linked from police patrols to a shootout between Eldridge Cleaver and the Oakland police, in which the youngest member of the party is killed. From 68 to 71, by the time you get to 68, much of the Panther male leadership is in prison. And they begin to embrace a program called Survival Pending Revolution. And it was shifting towards this armed self-defense rhetoric, towards the rhetoric of serving the community. This meant creating breakfast programs and other community service programs. In 1971 to 1974, the Panthers start out as a local organization in Oakland, California, and then they expand to San Francisco, but Oakland is their birthplace. By 1968, they've expanded across the country, and you have between 65 and 70 Panther chapters in the US and a few outside the US. There's a split that occurs in the party, and the split is a complex thing, but the counterintelligence program of the FBI played a very important role in this split, but there were also organic splits in the party. There were splits between the leadership, Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver goes into exile in 68, first to Cuba and then to Algeria, and they can only keep in touch with him by letter. And it lent itself to all different kinds of counterintelligence where false correspondence was sent to both Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. It helped to break the party apart. But it wasn't only orchestrated by the FBI. There were some real differences. Like, what was the party going to do? Huey Newton, after 68, repudiates armed struggle. and says that what we really need to do is reconnect with the Black community. He starts a very active policy of cultivating deep ties within the community. The breakfast programs are primarily located in Black churches. And it's an idea that the kind of armed militants of their early years had alienated the Black community. In order to keep the party strong and relevant, it needed to get involved in serving the essential needs of the community day to day. Eldridge Cleaver disagrees with this. He comes out of a different political formation. He's heavily influenced by anarchists and a kind of anarcho-syndicalism, and he believes in an offensive attack on the state. So there is an intellectual difference. The third piece of the split is that the party is dominated by people from Oakland throughout its history. That's where it's founded. But other chapters of the party, like New York City, the primary way that the party raised money was through selling its newspaper. And so in New York, many of you probably know about the Panther 21 case. This is the famous case in which Tupac Amaru, the hip hop artist, his mother is arrested. They had this enormous prosecution of them on conspiracy charges, and they're arrested in '69. So New York has enormous legal defense costs, much higher than Oakland, but Oakland controlled all the money in the party. Main source of money was selling the newspaper, and a lot of that material came from New York. So there are both material and ideological differences in the party that lead to the split. Today, I'm primarily going to be talking about the Oakland party because it is really the center of the party throughout the party's history. But there were different chapters of the party that assumed the character of their own communities. Finally, I would say 74 to 81 is when the party begins to decline in power. In 73 and 74, it runs electoral campaigns, running Bobby Seale for mayor and Elaine Brown for city council. Some of the Panthers do go into electoral politics. Bobby Rush, for example, in Chicago and got universities on the brain. In Illinois, is a former Panther. He's still currently a congressman from Chicago. So there's a whole electoral piece of the party that people know much less about. But after that period, you really begin to see a withering and a shrinking of the party in the mid-70s. So this first period of activism, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale meet at Merritt College. They come together over student organizing to institute a Black Studies program. There was a Negro history class being taught at night in Merritt College, and Bobby Seale said, quote, "We want to move Black history from the night into the daytime." So they also wanted a Black instructor. So it's discussions about Black history. They also protest the Bay of Pigs invasion. And it's kind of with student-based organizing on the Merritt campus that they come together and they participate in a study group called the Afro-American Association. So the Panther organizing itself starts on the campus, and they decide to leave the campus in 1966 when they formulate the 10-point program, which I read to you. And they argue that it's not enough if you want to mobilize people to simply argue with them or to tell them things or to instruct them. Their argument is that the thing that really will mobilize people is showing by example. So they go around and they talk to the community, and they're trying to figure out like what the community and Black community of Northern California wants. And what they find out is that the greatest source of anger is at the police. That people are facing many different problems, but it all coalesces in the police. So they come up with an idea. Huey Newton's a community college student. He's pouring through the California code book of like California statutes, and he finds out that it's legal to carry a loaded, unconcealed weapon. So he takes this idea and then weds it to a form of activism that was created after the Watts Rebellion. So I talked about the largest civil disturbance in history, also started by an instance of police brutality in Watts. Watts today is less than 20% Black, but in 1965, it was 98% Black with an all-white police force. And after the Watts Rebellion, local activists formed they were called community alert patrols. And the idea is that people would travel around, often in a car, with notebooks and tape recorders. And every time that they saw a policeman mistreating a Black subject, they would stop and they would document it. So this is the prehistory to the filmings that we see today that people do with their iPhones. So Huey Newton knew about this. One of the founders of these community alert patrols was called Brother Lenny. And Huey took the idea of the community alert patrol, and then he wedded it with this California statute and said, okay, so we already have people monitoring the police, but monitoring the police is not enough. What we actually want to do is enforce a change in police behavior. So the idea is that they would drive around and they would look for Black subjects being stopped by police. They would get out and they would hold the California statute, the collection of California statutes, and then they would stand there with loaded unconcealed weapons. And the principle behind this was that the state is not the only legitimate means of force, that the only way ultimately to stop the mistreatment of Black subjects is to enforce a change. So this is a big deal, as you can imagine. Initially, the police are really disoriented by it, to see people standing there, but they couldn't arrest them because it was legal. So it combined this interesting form, like a show of force, with a legal basis for it. So the Panthers institute this. They started doing it right around the time that they released the 10-point program. It's incredibly popular because people see them as standing up to the police and in some ways delegitimizing the police. 6 months later, the California legislature introduces a bill called the Mulford Bill. And it's introduced by Don Mulford, who is a councilman from Piedmont. He's a state senator from Piedmont, which is a very wealthy area that carved itself outside Oakland. I used to live just on the edge of Piedmont when I was a graduate student. And it overturned this law. So by May 2nd, 1967, it became illegal to carry loaded unconcealed weapons. So this period of the Panther police patrols, and you see a picture of one on the left, it's actually in effect for a relatively short period of the Panthers' history. So the party is a viable entity from October 66 through 1981 or 1982. But people, when they talk about the Panthers, they often focus on this first 6 months. Important to the party's history and combined with its vision of armed self-defense is an anti-colonial vision. So the party talked about Black Americans as an internal colony inside the United States. So this also explains the kind of paramilitary structure of the organization. They are modeling themselves in structure and rhetoric on the Cuban Revolution, and they see themselves as fighting an internal battle, a battle of decolonization, and also a fight for state socialism. So this is a picture of the Bootlickers Gallery, and the Panthers were basically born of Black migrants. These are working class people whose parents had migrated from the South, largely Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, to California to get jobs in the defense industry. The federal defense industry in Galveston and in that central part of all of the South, actually, not just in Galveston, but throughout the South, was segregated. But in California, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters had been able to challenge discrimination in the shipyards and was able to open it up for Black employment in 1942, 1943. Not right at the outset of the war, but by 42, 43, Black people could get jobs in the shipyards. So this is a big part of what draws these migrants to the Bay Area. But the Panthers, they were a working class movement. And so they were all about identifying with anti-colonial revolutions going on throughout the world. So a big part of the Panthers are allied with the radical wing of the anti-war movement in the United States. So they actually hate Lyndon Johnson, as you can see from this picture. And the Bootlickers Gallery is where they would put especially Black people that they saw as colluding with the power structure in the United States. So this is an image of the head of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, licking the boot of Lyndon Johnson. A core part of the Panthers' argument is that they linked domestic policing to the violence of US policing abroad. So I like to show, this is one of my favorite political cartoons of the Panthers because it manifests their ideology so beautifully. It's by Emory Douglas, the great artist. So it says, it's all the same. And if you notice, it says local police, National Guard, and Marines. The billy club that they're carrying is napalm. And then on their belt, it says gas and mace. So they're making a connection in their minds between the CS gas that's being used at home and the napalm that's being used in Vietnam. An important point about this iconography, Huey Newton discusses it in his book, Revolutionary Suicide, and he talks about how they came up with the iconography of calling the police pigs. And what he says is that, first, they're speaking to a Black population that's largely rural migrants from the South. So that's the most interesting thing. For an urban protest movement, they chose something that came largely from kind of the experience of rural people. And they wanted to figure out a way to delegitimize the police. They also wanted an iconography that was not racial, because both the anti-war protesters that they're allied with, like the Peace and Freedom Movement, and the Panthers themselves are getting beaten by police. So they chose the pig. Now, I'm a vegan, so I don't actually love the pig metaphor, but I do think it's a very powerful one, and it's crafted in a moment which is about how do you take a force that's seen as all powerful and then strip it of its power? So Huey Newton actually cites Nietzsche's genealogy of morals about essentially he who controls language controls power. Okay, so the party really expands in 68. It's founded in 66, but from 66 to 68, it's still a very small organization. It's largely Huey Newton and a core group of people that he knew, but there's a way in which repression and the coverage of the party, including the March from Sacramento, which is like a shot heard all around the world. The idea that when the Mulford Act was passed, the Panthers marched into the California State House with loaded unconcealed weapons. Huey was not there, but Bobby Seale was there. And Ronald Reagan, who's the governor of California, was standing outside talking to a troop of Boy Scouts. So you can imagine the kind of press coverage throughout the world of this small group of teenagers, largely people in their early 20s, marching into California State House with guns. An important thing I want to say about this, the Panthers are not advocates of the Second Amendment. This is a very different moment in time in which you have young people literally that understand themselves as doing the same thing that Fidel Castro was doing in Cuba, or that Ho Chi Minh had done in Southeast Asia. They are identified with anti-colonial forces that have successfully toppled regimes. So that's really important. This is not an invocation of the kind of gun culture we see today about the Second Amendment, or, you know, in many ways, the use of this visual use of guns now, it's shifted radically ideologically. So the way that they understood this was as an extension of the anti-colonial armed self-defense fights that are going on throughout the Cold War. By 1967, just a year later, all the Panther leadership is in prison. So Huey Newton is in prison for the shooting of alleged shooting of an Oakland officer. He's later acquitted in 1970. Bobby Seale is arrested on conspiracy charges and is bound and gagged before court in Chicago. Eldridge Cleaver, after April 4th, 1968, is largely underground and ends up in exile. So the male leadership of the party is less than a year after its founding, is nearly all incarcerated. One of the interesting things about the party is that they use repression to build the organization. So Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen Cleaver, who did much of the work that Eldridge Cleaver is praised for, came up with an idea, which is the Free Huey movement. And they turned Huey Newton into a political prisoner. And they have a countrywide campaign to free Huey. And it's in this period that the party really grows. This image that you see on the left is the same place that I showed you the images of the young people. That's still DeFremery Park, that the Panthers renamed Little Bobby Hutton Park after he was killed by the police. But you see the huge crowds. They are especially influential among college students, community college, state, university, all over the country. So it's in 1968 that the party really expands and grows. So when I talked about those 67 different chapters, it's that period when the party is at its largest. And I'd say at its very largest, it's about 5,000 people. This is an image at UC Berkeley, Sproul Plaza, Eldridge Cleaver addressing the crowds. If you could see them, something interesting about this is that the crowds are majority white. So there is enormous white support for the party, especially all over the country, but especially in the Bay Area. So the Panthers cultivated a series of multiracial alliances. So it is Fred Hampton, who's killed by the FBI and the Chicago police in December 1969. He was one of the most important architects of the Rainbow Coalition strategy. Today, when we hear the word Rainbow Coalition, we associate it with Jesse Jackson, and then perhaps afterwards with Barack Obama. But the actual original use of the phrase came from the party. And the idea is that the Panthers were an all-Black organization. They did have a few Japanese members and Armenian members that were very old friends that were inducted into the party, but for the most part, it was an all-Black organization. But their idea is that you had an all-Black organization that allied itself with other groups that shared the same politics. At the core of those politics was anti-imperialism, and what I call it, anti-state violence. It's a little bit of a neologism, because that's a phrase from today, but they were fighting police violence at home and military violence abroad, and they were anti-capitalist. So they are an all-Black organization that is closely allied and ran actually candidates on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. So they are completely intertwined with the radical anti-war movement. You know, there are two different wings of the anti-war movement. There's one that was isolationist, that was like, our boys are being killed and maimed, fighting over there in Vietnam, bring them home. And there was the radical wing that identified with Ho Chi Minh and saw itself as aligned with the forces trying to fight US imperialism. And it's that wing of the anti-war movement that the Panthers were aligned with. COINTELPRO disruption is very important to the history of the party. One of the things that frightened the state most about the party was its broad set of interracial alliances. These are alliances not only with whites, but also with the Brown Berets, with Iwar Kun, the Red Guard Party, which was an Asian American party in New York and California, with the Patriot Party, which was a party of like working class whites and Appalachians in Chicago. So the Panthers' mixture of anti-imperialism, anti-US foreign policy, with radical redistribution and anti-capitalism, with a rainbow set of alliances, terrified the FBI. And that's really important because there are a lot of different Black organizations in the 1960s. But the one that is overwhelmingly the focus of the state is this very small party that's composed largely of teenagers and people in their early 20s. And I don't think you can explain that level of fear and hatred that the state had about the party. It's racism combined with anti-communism, but also a fear of the kind of broad-based support and movement the Panthers were creating. So this is an image that's taken from a local branch of the FBI in Southern California. And it's representing, the Panthers held these anti-fascist conferences. There was one in Oakland in '68. I think that's the one that this is referring to, where you had large numbers of white attendants. So the FBI created this false cartoon to represent the party. And the idea is that the only reason they're sponsoring these interracial conferences is that you have Black men's desire for white women. So they're tapping into these deeply racist ideas that were, of course, the basis of lynching and of these different regimes of violence in the South. So from the point of view of the state and the FBI, the party's cross-racial radical alliances could only be represented as Black men's desire for white women, which is very depressing. So this is a picture of a priest. I like to refer to him as Black Power priest, Father Earl Neal, who was in SNCC. He was also part of the Panther advisory board. And he's important because, as I said, the Panthers located their breakfast programs. By '68, all the male leadership is in jail. the composition of the party begins to change, and Bobby Seale argues that by the end of 1968, the majority of the Panthers are actually women. As this happens, they shift their efforts from their previous focus on police patrols and armed self-defense to these community-based breakfast programs, which are probably the most famous that we know today, and also liberation schools. Interestingly, these are housed within Black churches. And this is a really interesting map that I created. It's combined with oral history research with sites that are still there today, and it shows where the different Panther breakfast programs were located in the different Panther offices. One of the reasons that there's so many is that they were constantly being shut down by the police, and they would have to move from one location to another. So I have 4 different locations for the Panthers national headquarters. I already talked about women in the party. Something striking about the party is that from 1974 to 1977, Elaine Brown was head of the party. In the 70s, as I'll be talking about, it's a very different party. It had largely turned to electoral politics, but its infrastructure of voter mobilization became important to electing the first Black mayor. Kathleen Cleaver, the wife of Eldridge Cleaver, is the first woman on the Central Committee. So the party, how do I put this? The party, women activists in the party were so important, but there's no question that there was a lot of misogyny in the party and particular barriers that women faced. Another Panther historian has described this by saying, no one ever asked what a man's place was in the revolution. That the vision of women revolutionaries was something hard for the external world outside the Panthers, but also inside the Panthers. The thing that's exciting to study about gender in the Panthers is that there were such large numbers of women in the organization, also a female head, which was not true of any of the other civil rights or Black Power organizations in the 1960s. So the Panthers is in some ways a laboratory of ways that you see women activists fighting for equality and representation in the party. An important piece of the Panthers' survival programs. So these were breakfast programs, which are later instituted by, of course, the federal government. We don't have a smoking gun or a specific memo, but it's pretty clear that the strategy is initiated after the Panther programs. An important point about this is that these food programs are not just voluntary, they are not just voluntarism. In the past, students have asked me, well, how is this different from what the Links or the Elks do or the Masons? How is this different than this kind of tradition of voluntarism? This piece is important. So the Panthers combine their breakfast and other food giveaway programs with a critique of the state. And their argument was, the state is not meeting people's needs. Federal welfare is too limited. And also, they're angry about the means testing. So in order to get aid for dependent children, there was a thing called the man in the house rule, that women with children could only receive federal aid if you could prove that there was no man in the house. So this meant that many fathers couldn't live with their children, social workers would stop by in unexpected times. So part of what the Panthers are doing is that they're using this food redistribution as a way to shame the state. So this is the use of these programs to help people, but also within a political context and connected to a political ideology. And it's very striking that it's in 1968 when they first implement these programs that J. Edgar Hoover gives his famous quote about the Panthers being the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. That the party faces some of its worst repression when it actually turns towards these redistributive programs and also schools. Because there was a terror on the part of J. Edgar Hoover and other people in the FBI that they were going to be a self-sustaining force that was creating a new generation of adherents. This is a picture from the Panther Freedom Schools. They took place all over the country. The longest running institution in the party was actually a school called the Huey P. Newton Intercommunal Institute that runs until 1981 in California. It was an amazing school that you had artists like Sun Ra, the jazz artist, teach there. They believed in non-authoritarian forms of instruction. They're influenced by the free school movement in the 1970s. So this is another important point, that while the Panthers are known for those first 6 months of their police patrols, their longest running institution is actually a K through 12 school. So I've already talked to you about the split, but there's a split that happens in the party from 1971 to 1974. It's very destructive, and it leads to these kind of battling between the Oakland-led portion of the party and then partially the Black Liberation Army. The role of counterintelligence is important to this, but it does seriously damage the organization. A lot of people leave, and it was hard. You know, fratricidal struggles are always really, really painful. So in 1973, Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale decide to launch an electoral run. And Bobby Seale ran for mayor and Elaine Brown for city council. They didn't win, but Bobby Seale's race forced a runoff with the other, with another candidate. So, and in the runoff, Bobby Seale won between 35 and 40% of the vote. So this was an enormous showing. If you think about what happens in third-party showings today, they were running in the Democratic Party primary, and then against the Republican. But the showing was amazing. And in order to launch this campaign, they have a voter registration drive that essentially ends up registering between 20 and 50,000 people to vote. 3 years later, you have the election of the first Black mayor. I've already talked about their set of broad grassroots alliances. There are exciting things about the electoral campaign, but also things to take note of. So the level of mobilization and infrastructure they created was amazing. So you see Bobby Seale would go on buses. You have the community colleges who largely became the poll workers, not poll workers, they became the campaign workers, that they run this incredibly powerful campaign with almost no money and win between 35 and 40% of the vote. And one of the main ways that's done is with a lot of college students and volunteers in their organizations. The problem with the electoral turn is that when it takes place, not everyone agrees. You have a lot of grassroots activists from all over the country who are actually drawn back to Oakland. They make Oakland the base of operations. So people from Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. and North Carolina and Los Angeles are all sent to Oakland to focus on a local election. Not everybody was happy with this. In their home communities, they still had political prisoners who were still in prison that they felt weren't getting sufficient legal support and help. So I'd say in terms of the party, the late 70s is the period kind of its breaking apart. A lot of that focuses on Huey Newton and his own personal struggles. But I think there's a larger problem of one, a social movement group trying to remain relevant in the 1970s. The conditions are so different than in the late 1960s. Another one is that a lot of the rank and file was not happy about the electoral turn. They didn't support it, even though the leadership did. So the party, more or less, is disbanded. It's officially disbanded, I guess, in 1980, but the Panther School continues until 1981 or 1982. So we often date the end of the party with the closing of the Panther School. Many of the Panthers became active in other groups and movements and organizations. I'm writing a book about crack in Los Angeles, and lo and behold, a lot of the Panthers show up as people protesting the Iran, what we now know as Iran-Contra, but protesting both Cold War violence abroad and state violence at home. So even though the organization is disbanded, many of the Panthers themselves continue full lives of activism. So I wanted to end just by talking about myself a little bit, which is that, so I wrote a book on the Panthers. I've been a part of the movement, I would say, of scholars and activists fighting state violence, documenting the rebellions that have taken place since 2012 inside the United States, and continuing in many ways the work of the Panthers and talking about state violence. Right now, I'm actually very active in our union, our local union, AAUP, AFT, Rutgers, all three campuses. And the question is, how do these two things connect with each other? The Panthers at their core were anti-capitalists, and they were also concerned with the kind of international dimensions of struggle. But a core piece of the fight for full employment, the fight for housing, the fight for socialism was core to Panther ideology. And I have become very active in our local union because we have a very militant union. It's probably one of the most militant faculty unions in the country, arguably the most. And we're trying to figure out how to build a social justice union and then to build a broad coalition. So right now, there are very interesting things going on at Rutgers because we have not only the faculty union, AAUP, AFT, that covers faculty, tenure and non-tenure track faculty and graduate students. We have a separate bargaining unit that covers part-time lecturers and adjuncts. But we have a coalition right now with 19 other unions covering 20,000 workers in the state of New Jersey. So I've just been spending a lot of my time in the last 2 years working with our union and thinking about the fight over, how do I put this? The fight over public sector employment. So not just understanding the university as the kind of ivory tower, or even in the way that I've understood it in my own book as the platform for revolutionary struggle, but now also thinking about, especially in this moment of the largest moment of economic crisis since the Great Depression, thinking at it as a core site of redistribution and of public sector employment. So I will end there. Thank you.